on how the threat of the long economic COVID looms now. We have seen in the recent past countries going and trying to protect their own domestic markets. We have seen geopolitical equations changing. We have seen countries, the global value chains coming under threat. We have seen regional value chains sometimes even not working the way it should work. So there's a lot that's happening there over the last 6 months to a year. But I'm sure we have two fantastic people out there who are going to talk about it and give us what we could expect in the coming months and years. Over to you, Shekhar, for this discussion with Martin. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And Martin, welcome to this session. I'm privileged to be asked to converse with you on this. Martin Wolf, I will not waste your time, everybody's time, introducing Martin for too long, except to say that he's not only chief economics commentator for Financial Times, but he's a very influential voice, among the most influential voices in the world when it comes to not just economics, but also political economy and politics, because politics and economy go together. Martin also is a frequent traveler to India, knows India well, writes about India often. And if you want to see how much feeling he has for India, please read the piece he wrote. I don't want to say obituary, but a sort of a parting tribute to Ishar Jajaluwalia. And in fact, if you go to his Twitter page, that will be the second entry there after his pinned tweet. So please read that. Martin, thank you very much. And if I may call you a global doctor of economies and politics, give us your diagnosis now and then give us the treatment. So diagnosis first.
Well, how many hours do we have? So let's briefly summarize where we are. First of all, I think it's very important to remember that before COVID hit us, there were already some very big problems in the world economy and world politics. So it didn't come on a truly healthy patient. Of course, some countries were in better state than others. India actually was in relatively good shape. But worldwide, we had some big problems. I mean, the most important is that we'd had a huge financial crisis in the West just 12 years ago. It's not very long ago. So it's extraordinary these things came so close together. And we never in the West fully recovered. If you look in detail, you will see that our economies never fully recovered. And that crisis also affected the people in the West. And that's one of the reasons why we saw this upsurge in populism, nationalism, protectionism, particularly the election of Donald Trump and Brexit, both quite important events. So there's the global financial crisis and its political consequences. The second, of course, big thing has been big change in global economic power. The rise of emerging countries, particularly, of course, China and India, and of course, above all, the emergence of a new superpower under a more authoritarian, more nationalist, more assertive leader in Xi Jinping since 2012. And with that, very clear with Trump, the breakdown in relations, the progressive breakdown in relations between the US and China, the disintegration of the post-Cold War multilateral order, which Trump was really an expression. So these two things had happened already. Then COVID-19 hit us, and in the short run, basically every country that was where this happened, and it's now all over the world, hit a very deep recession. I think there's really no exception to that. It's true in China. It just happened in China sooner because it started there, and because the economies were effectively closed down. They were closed down with a mixture of voluntary action by countries, by people, just saying, I'm frightened, I'm not going out. I'm not going to go to the shops. I'm not going to go to the movies. I'm not going to travel. Travel collapsed. And And of course, this was reinforced by policies of lockdown, which were used to a greater or lesser extent pretty well everywhere. So the first and second quarters saw the most dramatic plunges in GDP output, activity, particularly uniquely hitting the service sector most. That's a unique phenomenon in that that we've ever seen, which is the most dramatic plunge in activity we've ever seen. In the third quarter, in most countries, we are seeing recoveries, particularly in the developed world, very much so in China. I think also in India, though I haven't followed that so closely. But these recoveries are petering out for two reasons. Partly because we've got a very big second wave in Europe, and the first wave in the US and the Americas has never really gone away. The only exception is China. Of the big countries, there is an expectation that China's growth this year will actually be positive, about 2%, still 4 percentage points below it's the normal, but still positive. Nowhere else of importance will have positive growth. And it looks as though the recovery is petering out. And part of the reason is the second wave, and the other reason is lots of people are still very cautious all over the world. People, particularly with money, the people who can spend are the people who can stay at home, the people who have good jobs or wealth, and they have a lot of the income and they spend a lot of the money, and they don't want to travel. Many of them are not so young, probably like us, and they want to stay alive. Now, that's where we are today. I think the questions ahead, and I'll conclude with this, is so what happens next? And there are probably two huge elements in this. The first is what happens to the disease. Is it effectively sufficiently under control, one way or the other, vaccine or herd immunity, that people sort of go around their normal business? My own view is it's very unlikely that we have full global control of this disease in less than 2 years, and it could well be longer. It's going to be around. Even if vaccines arrive and they work, which are very big questions, that spreading them across the whole planet, and it has to be the planet, is really hard to do. So that will be a constraint, a serious constraint. And the second really big issue is the second round implications of these political economic stresses. And here, of course, the US election will be an important factor. But I have the sense, as has already been mentioned, that trade relations are not going to go back to normal. This will be particularly true of trade in goods. And relations between the US and China will not recover fully. People will be more cautious, therefore, about investment in things that bring the economies together. And therefore, and this comes to my column this week, we will get, the recovery will be quite weak. We won't go back to normal. It will probably leave long scars, and we will have what I call the long economic COVID, as we're having in the disease. We're talking about long COVID, which means people remain ill even if they're better for a very long time. This is my worry about the world economy. So as briefly as I could, this would summarize how I see things globally now.
Well, long economic COVID is a worrying prognosis, but that's the reality that we should not hide from. Now, Martin, you know that I come more from a political vantage point. So before we go more into economics, you said that the last financial crisis left scars or left after effects, which sparked this wave of nationalism and protectionism. Do you think this pandemic could do that, or do you think this pandemic could undo that?
I think that's one of the most interesting and important questions, and the obvious answer at this stage is we don't know. One of the things we know is that political ramifications of big economic and health shocks tend to take time. The first impact of something like this is a shock, it's fear, and then at some point comes the anger. And the anger comes when people say, it wasn't dealt with fairly. It wasn't dealt with effectively. The people in charge of incompetent crooks, whatever. That's how ordinary people tend to respond. And politicians, even if they're authoritarian politicians, cannot ignore the feelings of the people. I mean, there is no society in which you can truly ignore the feelings of the people. So this is a shock that could generate these consequences. So I just focus on what's happened in the Western world because otherwise it takes too much time. But the COVID has had dramatically unequal effects in our societies. In terms of the illness, of course, itself, it mostly affects and is most fatal for the old. The young are relatively immune to the disease, but the young have been dramatically victims of the economic consequences. So a lot of the economic burden, the loss of jobs, the loss of prospects is borne particularly by those entering the labor market. I imagine the same must be true in India. Then we found working mothers have been dramatically badly affected because they have somehow have to combine being at home with their children. They're still doing most of the childcare and they expect to do their jobs too. They're relatively educated still. I mean, so that's a big problem. In our country, marginal communities, particularly ethnic minorities have been more badly affected than others. And of course, unskilled people, most of whom do work in face-to-face activities. The ability to work online, as I'm able to do from home, is basically for those people who work by writing and speaking, not by people who make things or do things with other people. So it's dramatically disequalizing. And then in addition to this, there was already a lot of anger about all that before we started. So you've seen the explosion of Black Lives Matter. It's a symbol of this anger. It was a very real thing. So there's a lot of anger out there, and of course, in the more comfortable parts of the community, there's fear about this. What is that going to destabilize our historic positions? Are they going to start charging us more tax? So I think in the short run, politics will become and has become more high voltage, more intense, more bitter. Now, the question then really is who wins in this new and more disturbing canvas, dramatic canvas of politics, who wins? And I think it looks as though the center will be further hollowed out, probably. And we are in the Western world, it looks as though we have sort of emerging two extremes. Younger people, more educated people, more middle-class people are going for a more left-wing, leftish, build back better, more redistributive, more green, but also in some ways quite inward-looking economy, self-sufficiency, that sort of thing. And on the right, we have a mixture of nationalism, some protectionism, particularly in America, xenophobia, and a desire to reimpose a sort of the traditional order, if you like. And that is backed by the very rich and the old working classes. Who will win, I don't know. But our politics, it seems to me, have been further destabilized. How this will... And then attitudes to China in the West have, I think, across the board deteriorated. That's not a lot left-right for different reasons. The left doesn't, human rights, the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, all these sorts of issues. The right, it's economic nationalism. So I think the international relations effects are unambiguous.
I'm interested by this comment because you say the left is irritated with China because of Uyghurs and Hong Kong human rights issues. And the right is irritated because of trade issues, but you didn't mention strategic issues.
Well, that's because of lack of time. No, I think there is so let's just take the US because it's the most important. There is now, I feared this would happen, emerging pretty well a national consensus that China is the strategic enemy. And but what people emphasize most tends to depend obviously on who they are. I mean, everybody. But if you look at the issues, there's the strategic rivalry issue, which is certainly believed by the sort of the center of American politics and the right. There is the technological rivalry, which is an issue for the business, important parts of the business community and the security establishment and the economic establishment. There are the trade issues, which are a subset of those two, security and technology, but also, in addition, the trade issues connect, though less than they used to, with jobs for working class people, the sort of Trump supporters. And then there is a range of human rights, moral issues, which are felt more strongly on the left. But the many Americans, I think a very large number of Americans, would have some sympathy, though to varying degrees, with all of those things. Interestingly, Mr. Trump is, if anything, less hawkish than some of the others. He doesn't care about the human rights, of course. He doesn't care about democracy. That's perfectly obvious. He focuses on trade more than anything else. He doesn't really want wars. One attractive thing about him. Many of the members of his cabinet are much more hawkish, and many of the people around Mr. Biden are very hawkish because they feel, that the partnership they wanted with China hasn't worked out. China hasn't evolved the way they thought it might. I think it was very naive. So I think the important thing to understand is that this relationship between the US and China has become a bipartisan, across the board issue with different flavors, different emphases. The way they would pursue this will be different between Biden and Trump. There'll be quite important differences. But I think the breakdown in relations and the tension between them, the desire to separate them, is very strong. There's really only one important community, I think, which is still very strongly supportive of engagement, and that is those parts of the business community which have very profound links with China and Chinese production. But even they, companies like Apple, for example, are sort of concluding that they're going to need two different supply chains, as it were. There's going to be an Asia-China supply chain, which will be autonomous, and there will be a American one. Europe will be somewhere in between, and they will be essentially separate. And the Americans will pay more as a result, for sure. And there are lots of questions that arise out of this. The role of Taiwan is incredibly important, not only strategically, but economically, because Taiwan is one of the world's most important suppliers of absolutely key technology components. And they're in both. So how that all plays out is a huge set of questions. But I think the desire to separate the two worlds and the choices that will create for other countries, countries will have to decide, which world are you going to be part of? How are you going to play this off? That will be a universal issue.
Yeah. Now, if this again leads to protectionism, self-reliance, which our Prime Minister calls Atmanirbhar, that's a new mantra now in our country. Unfortunately, it takes us back to license quota Raj of the 70s. In the few steps that have been taken so far, we have licensing on automobile tires now. We have licensing for air conditioner imports now, and I think more will happen. And tariffs are being raised. Nevertheless, if these impulses are strengthened by this pandemic, then what does that do to the prospects of American elections fortnight from now? Does it strengthen Trump, weaken Trump?
I don't think. It looks as though the people who will support Trump on trade issues are his absolutely core base.
Yes.
They're not going to go away. But they're not enough to win the election.
Right.
The reality is, most Americans now, look, only 10% of Americans, people don't realize, work in industry. Right? the old days, that's a point I'm making in the book I'm writing, the old days when manufacturing industry was the dominant employer of a huge proportion of the labor force has long since gone in the major Western countries. So then there are more people who've lost their jobs. They're very upset, of course. But even then, you get 20, 25%. Then there are other supporters of Trump, the Christian right, as it's called, evangelicals, social conservatives. There are small business. There's a very important constituency of people who run small and medium-sized businesses who haven't been to university. One of the most important support groups are people who haven't been to university who loathe the people who have. So that's an interesting new class. But they're all in his camp. And together they make up about maybe 40% of the population. And his problem is he seems to have lost everyone else. Now, the other people, the people he's lost, are not really deeply invested in these trade issues. They're interested in what happens with COVID. How badly or well did he do with that? Well, most of them think he did pretty badly. Questions of gender and race are very important for many of these people. The whole tone and nature of his government, for many people who have, remember, a huge proportion of American population is educated. They have been to university. They don't like this sort of. So it's a culture war election in very significant measure. At the moment, we will see what happens, and I'm given up predicting American elections or British Brexit campaigns. But at the moment, it seems that Trump has lost support in these other groups, and they're a very big chunk of the election. So I think the dominant view is that Biden would win the votes. Of course, in the American Constitution, winning the votes doesn't mean he will win the presidency. We don't know how that will play out. If it's close, it could be a real mess. But that's, I think, roughly where we are. But I think the key point to your question is that the protectionism, these issues, they're all sort of in the core of his vote. They're not really up for grabs.
Yeah, those are. In fact, the funny thing about Trump is that he seems to have the most consistent, loyal base in a long time.
Yeah,
it's never gone below that 40% very much.
There are people who adore him. He plays to them. He likes them. He has a relationship with them. But his problem is that he's never gone beyond it.
Yeah, and I think the one important thing in America, as you see from the polls, is that he's lost a lot of women.
Yeah. Yes. And that's a pretty big. The gender gap in the polls is staggering.
Staggering.
It's staggering. It's the biggest there's ever been, and there are an awful lot of women, and that was not a good thing to, it's not a good thing in America to try and win the presidency if you've got the women against you.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. There is a gender gap and there's an education gap. Yes. But here, it doesn't hit you so much because not that many people have gone to university. But half of your voters are women. So that's very important. Now, if Biden comes, if it's a Biden presidency, given the pressures he has from his own left, which is very noisy. Now, what America does influences global economics. So what changes might we see in America, and what influence will that have on the rest of us?
Well, if Biden wins, his administration will unquestionably be pretty centrist.
Right.
And Pelosi will remain leader of the House, and the leader of the Senate presumably will be Chuck Schumer if they win the Senate.
Right.
And these are all centrists. They're all centrists. So there will be pressure from the left, but you can assume that the tone of the administration, the sort of people will be in it, will be very similar to the Obama administration. I mean, I know a lot of the people who will be in it. I mean, there's no great secret about this. Now, what difference would this make? How different would it be from the Obama administration? It's an interesting point. So I think that it will be more hostile to China. They were already moving in that direction under Obama. Remember the pivot to Asia and the creation of the Transpacific Partnership were all part of the American aim to create a coalition of countries to balance against China. The policy, for example, reaching out to India is bipartisan. I mean, it's a pretty obvious example, and indeed, it seems to me to be bipartisan in India. I mean, it goes from the Manmohan Singh government to the Modi government. So there are fundamental structural factors driving relations which won't change. What I think will be different about the Biden approach is his trade policy. He won't roll back all the tariffs, but I think he will approach the trade policy issues in a somewhat more multilateral way, trying to make the WTO work. That will fit in with his attempt to create, very differently from Trump, alliances he will try to rebuild his alliances so that the trade policy and other aspects of it, security policy, the whole thing will be done in a less unilateral way. So I think he will try to build an alliance with Europe, and in order to approach China, to have a common policy towards China on trade, on investment, on the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm sure he will try to do the same with India across the board. I don't know whether this will work. And of course, he will try and strengthen alliances in the Asia-Pacific region. Though the relation between Trump and the Japanese has been pretty good, but I think he will try to take that further. So it will be similar strategic aims. The difference will be the approach will be more like that of the Americans in the Cold War running an alliance system than America all on its own. And the outcome, I think, will be, I think that's a better policy for America, but it will certainly continue in that form. But we won't go back to where we were in 2015. I think that's pretty obvious. It will be a different sort of administration because the context has changed. I haven't mentioned, but of course, though this is, I think, very exaggerated, of course, he will go back into the Paris Accord on climate. That's a very big consensus. The Democrats accept the climate consensus. They are very supportive of it. They'll certainly go back into the WHO, but they will continue to bash China in that, and they will push China in climate. So these are important changes in tactics and in changes in engagement with the world, but I think the strategic objectives will remain the same. And of course, then that raises the big issue: can you disentangle the West from China? This is not like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not engaged in the world economy. China is enormous in the world. It's the biggest trader in the world. That's going to be very complicated. Nobody really knows how that's going to play out.
So if I may put it simplistically, if I may raise a simplistic question, it is America's allies who will be thrilled if Trump loses. And it's America's adversaries, which is China and Russia, who will be heartbroken if Trump loses.
I'm inclined to think that. The allies will, well, I don't know about all the allies. The Europeans will be ecstatic. This is the America they like. I think the Asians will be pretty happy too. They know Biden. They were perfectly comfortable with Obama. Biden will be tougher. They probably like that. But Putin, I think that's for sure true. I mean, Trump was extraordinarily friendly to Putin, and he's the only significant American figure who likes the Russians. I mean, China is more complicated because while they could work with Trump and they could manipulate Trump, he's an unpredictable figure. And my sense of the Chinese leadership is they like predictability. They like stability. So I suspect they're a bit in two minds about which they would prefer. And Trump was weakening America. That's certainly their view.
Absolutely.
And that's nice. They like that. But on the other hand, dealing with somebody who's sort of a predictable player does lower the temperature. And I think that might be quite attractive for many of them.
Yeah, because you mentioned Trans-Pacific Partnership just now. The first thing Trump did was to dismantle that. So Chinese should have sent him an enormous thank you card for that.
Yes, they were very happy.
They were very happy. Now, coming closer, America can look at China in a certain way. Japan can also look at China in a certain way. But think of us, we are next door to China. And our economy has got very closely tied with Chinese supply chains, etc., etc. Where do you see India headed now? Give us your larger picture on India's economy and also prospects, particularly as India now, it's a strategic and political imperative for India to decouple from China.
Well, so I'm going to accept your last statement as a fact. Okay.
Right.
Because my impression, indeed, but I haven't been to India for a while, is that India, at least at the sort of strategic community level, and I mean economics, has indeed decided to try to decouple from China. It's going to be complicated, very complicated. Well, the fundamental problem, India and an economic, so let's just start the starting point, which is obvious, which we discussed, I think, earlier. But if not, let's go. We all know that India's underlying growth was slowing before COVID-19.
Yeah.
And a number of economists whom I know and respect, Indian economists, had become very concerned about underlying.
If I may interrupt, the previous 8 quarters, it was going down like this.
Yes. And this has been true since, well, it slowed down, but pretty obvious for 4 years or so, something like that. So that's a very big issue. India has to grow for reasons that everybody understands, given the aspirations of the people and the need. You cannot solve the problems of India with income redistribution. You need more income. So that was a huge challenge. And it seemed to me, I did visit India not so long ago and actually met the finance minister. And it was pretty clear that the general response was, let's become more protectionist. And you mentioned that yourself, but that discussion made it perfectly clear. And I think that could only make it worse. In India's case, we have a long history, which the first book I ever wrote was about this, India's trade policies. We have a long history of inward-looking development, and it hasn't worked very well. Didn't work very well anywhere. So I think the tendencies were very bad. Then you have the COVID-19 shock, which obviously means that you want a huge, strong economic recovery. When things get back to normal, you need a tremendous amount of acceleration. And that's very difficult given some of the structural weakness you have, the debt overhang in the private sector, the weakness of the banking sector, and the underlying slowdown in growth, of course, further weakens investment demand, and it's a vicious circle. And then you've got all this geopolitical uncertainty. So the economic challenges for the Indian government are, in my view, enormous. There's a tremendous danger, to me, of a return, not so bad, but to something like the old Hindu rate of growth. You end up getting stuck at between 4 and 5%, which is not enough. Now, in that context, obviously, this breakdown we're talking about is very damaging. So your strategic imperative risks becoming very, very economically damaging. My advice to the Indian government would be to try to remain open to both sides economically. If that's impossible, because the breakdown on the political side is so great and your vulnerability vis-a-vis China is so great. That probably means shifting economically and integrating more with both neighbors and the West and East Asia. That will diminish opportunities. And there's no doubt at all in my mind that over the next 10, 15 years, China will be the biggest and fastest growing market in the world. It's bound to be. So if you lose that because of the strategic breakdowns, and this is true for us too, but certainly for you, it's going to be very costly. This is going to be the world's biggest market for pretty well everything. So the ideal will be to conduct your politics to some degree separate from the economics. But I know that's very difficult. So all I would say is you're in some very, very big strategic dilemmas in which your politics and security policy and your economic needs are going to clash in important ways. And I don't know how you're going to resolve them.
So, Dr. Wolf, write a prescription for India. The 3 things or 5 things, it's a television question, 3 things or 5 things that India needs to do now.
Well, I suppose I think that the core things, despite what I said in terms of economics, so I will leave aside the geopolitics of this because it's not my field of expertise, and I do think you're going to have to be engaged in balancing China. I don't think there's any real choice for you, given where you are. You need to be part of a balancing alliance with vis-a-vis China. I think it's ineluctable. In economics, you have to fix the legacy problems, of which the most important are the debt problems, the reconstruction of the financial system, the reconstruction of the private sector balance sheets. That's obviously the single most important thing. I leave aside COVID-19. That's the single most important thing to generate growth. Then there are some reforms which are now thinking of working upon, which are sort of second round reforms people have talked about, labor markets and so forth, land markets, so forth, which are very important for longer term growth. You are going to need, and I'm personally prepared, and that's sort of the third thing, I think you're going to need to work out a very serious investment program, which will probably involve public-private partnerships. But investment is going to have to be a very important source of growth. And it's been very weak for a long time. That's the immediate thing. So that's the third big thing. Trade policy is the fourth big thing. I think I think the sort of tendency towards self-sufficiency is going to prove crippling, and in contrary, you should be leading trade liberalization. It's your future. Arvind Subramaniam had a very nice article in the FT just a week or so ago on the need for developing countries to exploit trade. And then finally, of course, there are the really big, crucial long-term issues, of which I think people in this forum have been discussing. To me, they are education and health spending, education in particular. If you compare India with China, I would say the biggest difference has been China's relative success in educating the entire population to a high level compared with India. And that's a tremendously important for growth in the long term, particularly growth which will include and benefit the entire Indian population. That won't be solved overnight, but I would say you spend far too little on education and it's not good enough. And your health system, I think that's been revealed, is also far too small for a country of your level of development. And that means reallocating government spending and making it more efficient. So I've covered 5 issues. Obviously, some are much more urgent and some are in a way more important. So the last thing I talked about, I put into the more important but less urgent because it's there always, and the fixing the debt overhangs having a clean balance sheets in the public and private sector, having properly functioning financial systems, financial markets again, that's very urgent.
Yeah. So just for clarity, the Hindu rate of growth in India is a purely secular concept, and it's a secular tragedy.
Yes, it's got nothing to do with the religion.
Nothing to do with
This is a phrase which, if I remember, was invented by my dear friend Raj Krishna,
Krishna, yes.
who was a dear friend of mine, and it was in the 1970s, and he was referring to the time when growth was about 3%, and GDP per head was basically stagnant. It's when I started working on India, and he was saying that has to change. And of course, it did change, and it even reached 8%, which was a tremendous transformation. It's obvious when somebody who's gone to India for 50 years, as I have, the transformation is obvious, but the slowdown is very disturbing. I'm not saying it's going back to 3, but 4 or 5. That means GDP per head growing at about 2 to 3, as opposed to 6. That's a colossal difference.
Yes. Particularly now that the economy has grown to, GDP has grown to such a level. Now, you talked about more investments. From where will the money come?
Well, there are two answers to that. Well, I'm rather, there are three answers to it. There are two answers. First of all, interestingly, Indians save quite a lot. India is one of the big advantages. It's not quite like East Asians, but Indian households save a lot. Unlike most countries, your savings don't get generated mostly by the corporate sector. In China, most of them get generated by the corporate sector. Indian households save a lot. So there clearly are savings in India. Unfortunately, a lot of it is consumed by government deficits, current deficits. Okay, that's not a very good idea. But there are clearly domestic sources of funds, which in principle, with the right financial system, business should be able to tap. Unlike Latin America, for example, India has a high rate of household savings. So provided it's not crowded out by wasteful government spending, I'm in favor of government investment. And of course, in the current situation, the government has to spend for current purposes. It's a crisis. But basically, there are domestic savings. Second, my view is that India, with the right policy environment, should be, and I mean this absolutely seriously, particularly in the current situation, the most attractive place for foreign investment in the world. And I mean this absolutely seriously. It is a colossal country with enormous potential, lots of talented people, a large and rapidly growing market. It is, from the Western point of view, friendly. And businesses are desperately looking for places to find profitable investments. It's not easy anymore. So I think in the right environment, India could attract enormous amounts of foreign money. So I really don't think investable funds are the issue. It's profitable investments which look as though they're going to work that are the issue, not the funding. I don't think in the right policy environment that the funding is going to be from domestic resources and foreign resources. And I mean FDI predominantly in equity, so not with large financial risks. I think that India could actually do remarkably well as a place that the Japanese, the Europeans, the Americans would all love to invest in.
So a trick question here. The social stresses in India, the politics of the BJP and Modi government and social stresses linked to it. Do you think that's a negative for likely foreign investors, or they don't care as long as they get the right environment for running their businesses?
I will be diplomatic, but I can be less diplomatic if you want. But
yes.
I think foreign investors
just be reckless.
Foreign investors, let's look at it as a foreign investor, not as me, want to believe that the place that they're investing in is politically stable. That means mega stable and locally stable. That is to say, it's peaceful, it's with a predictable environment, politically, and so forth. So that's the first thing. They want to believe that the legal system works. That's a big question in India. You probably, the famous or notorious Vodafone case was very damaging. Because people say, yeah, I want to invest in it, but I don't want to get involved in that. So that's a very big issue. They want to be confident that they will get, this is pretty obvious, highly qualified workers, decent infrastructure, and that's very important to them. And they want to be able to have a predictable policy regime. In a way, that's more important than a liberal one, though obviously if you're engaged in trade and you're importing stuff and making it into something and re-exporting, which many will do, then you want to be sure that trade policy remains liberal. So those are the 5 things you'll be looking at. Now, the first is, of course, political stability. And that means having a strong government which generates law and order and all the rest of it in a predictable way. They're not going to be concerned, I think, on the whole, with the precise nature of your political system, whether everybody is happy with what's going on. That's not on the whole something that investors do. But if investors feel that there's going to be lots of upheaval and excitement and violence near them, that will put them off big time. Of course it will. So those are the things they will look at. And I think there are concerns among investors on all 5 points. I wouldn't say the first is the dominant one. And India has never, in my view, been able to exploit its potential as an investment destination and as an economic partner, its potential being so large because of these concerns. Now, as it pointed out, lots of people are saying to themselves, well, we're going to have to disengage from China to some degree. So where are we going to go? Where are we going to move our supply chains? What countries will we? And they will certainly be looking at India for sure. But I think for many businesses, these concerns I've indicated, would say to them, it's going to be too complicated, too unpredictable. The infrastructure is not good enough. The policy environment isn't stable enough. There's lots of messy politics going on. I'd rather not. And I think that's the attitude abroad. If you're looking for really big time foreign investment, looking at the sort of thing China was able to do and leverage, then that has to change. You know all this. I haven't told you anything you don't know.
When you say this, people take it more seriously than when I do. You've dealt with Indian economic bureaucracy, the establishment, through generations of them. Almost 50 years, as you said. How would you rate the current team?
Well, that's awkward. Okay, I don't know the officials. When I worked on India in the 70s and afterwards, because so many of my very close friends were actively engaged, as you know, at the official level, mostly former colleagues at the World Bank who came back, and of course Manmohan Singh, who I've known since the 70s. I got to know many of the senior officials, Vijay Kelkar, many others. So Bimal Jalan and a whole generation of officials, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, of course, a long list. So I knew these, and I thought these people at that level were really pretty good. I mean, they compared completely with people in any government in the world. I mean, any government in the world, in their competence. I didn't know people lower down, but of course, India has lots of very smart economists, met them regularly. So I would say the officials were pretty good. The ministers varied, but a great deal over this period. Some of them were really quite weird, but the officials were pretty good. Now, in this case today, I don't know the officials in the same way. The economists I knew and respected, who were associated with the government, Raghuram Rajan at the Reserve Bank, Arvind Subramaniam, Arvind Panagaria. I knew all these people. They've all gone, and their replacements certainly don't have corresponding intellectual weight in the world. That's a simple statement of fact. And I thought really rather highly of Arun Jaitley. Very much a political figure, but I thought I respected him a lot. I thought his team at the Ministry of Finance looked rather good. I'm rather less persuaded of this of the current incumbent. So my impression would be that between Modi 1 and Modi 2, if you like, the two terms, that the people I recognize as top class professionals have gone. The finance minister I respected personally and professionally, intellectually, has gone, tragically. And it feels now like, and everybody tells me this, but this is secondhand, though I've met the Prime Minister, that this is a government completely dominated by the Prime Minister and his own team, which doesn't include top class economic expertise. So in the areas that I'm concerned about, I have become concerned at a relatively narrow intellectual base, a relatively poor pool of ministers dealing with these issues, relatively poor. And I've been told, but here I have no direct experience, that at the official level, it's not quite what it was either. So let us put it this way, concerning. And of course, they have made one or two decisions which has shocked us outside. Demonetization is a very good example. I mean, that was a shock on many possible levels. It doesn't provide, it's the sort of thing that makes people say, is this government predictable? The protectionism you talk about is another example. So if I look at it, I know it's a lengthy answer, from the point of view of someone who's followed India with only very partial knowledge, at the top official level, at the economics level, and at the ministerial level, this looks a pretty weak government. The Prime Minister is obviously an utterly formidable politician and an utterly formidable personality, but whether he's able to do this all on his own, I think, is a question. It's worth noting, because I follow this more closely. I mean, Xi Jinping is, of course, an utterly dominant political figure in China, but they have a really deep cadre of policy advisors at the senior level. I know them, a lot of them, and he listens to them. I mean, the Chinese are very, very professional about doing policy, and it takes a bench of people that the top person will listen to and respects, and they're all professional. I mean, the people who do this in China, they've all been to, they've all got doctorates, most of them from Western universities. So these are very serious professionals, and it is a concern that is deteriorating in India.
Yeah. So these are bench of talented people who the big powerful leader listens to, not the bench of highly talented people who listen to the big powerful people, because everybody listens to the big powerful leader.
Of course, a great leader, a successful leader, must always have advisors who, I just was reading this wonderful thing about the relationship between Churchill and the chief of the Imperial General Staff in the Second World War, Alan Brooke, who famously disagreed with him at every meeting. And Churchill found it very annoying, and he always listened. The most important quality in a top leader, Roosevelt had this too. He was surrounded by people like George Marshall, and it's the quality of advisors that really tell you the quality of a leader.
Yeah. And the ability to listen.
Yes, of course.
Now,
that goes together.
We are coming towards the end of this, and I'm for a next 2 minutes, I intend to stay in India. You've dealt with this economic bureaucracy, and some of us have a view, it's a view that I have also written about, that India had a species called the economy bureaucrat. And these were professional economists or even IAS officers who specialize in economics, people like Subbarao, Y.V. Reddy, for example, who then transcended the tenure of many political governments and many political systems. So there was continuity of economic thought, particularly since the reform came in. Do you find that missing now? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, certainly, I mean, I could go through the long list. I think the quality of the very top officials working in economic policy over the time that I was involved, which was starting in the 70s, was extraordinarily high. They were frustrated, and I sometimes felt that they didn't push their point of view as much as they should have done. That's another matter. But I was more frustrated with the politicians, because the politicians, as Montek's book brings out so well, never really promoted and defended reform. The reform was done by stealth, which I think was a great mistake in a democracy. It wasn't really, there's a big political failure, but these officials were really, really first rate. I don't know the current ones, so it will be unfair for me to say they're obviously worse. I don't know them. The ones I did know have all gone. Of course, many of them were people who were sort of partly in America and partly in India, and I know this was a problem. I actually have found the new governor of the Reserve Bank of India impressive. But I don't know him well, but I actually found him rather impressive.
That's Shaktikanta Das.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was very favorably surprised, as it were, when I talked to him. Now, you never really know.
He's a good person, yes.
Yes, he's a good person. So that's important. The Reserve Bank of India is a very important institution. So I wouldn't say, it would be completely wrong for me to say it's obviously worse than it used to be. But I do, as I said before, well, these people are very, very important. Political leadership is very important too. The nature of the political leadership is very important. And to me, there are two really key questions here. The first is, as we said, does Mr. Modi listen to a broad enough bench of good advisors? I think there's a big question. To me, this looks a very centralizing government. And the second and more profound issue is, who is the real Mr. Modi? He got elected as a reformer. He's done some important reforms, there's no doubt. The GST, things like this. He's also made some very strange decisions. He has instincts which are sometimes in the liberalizing, reforming direction, and sometimes in the very top-down authoritarian way. So, and then there's, of course, all the other aspects of BJP ideology, which I'm not going to refer to. So who is the real Modi is a really big issue here. And because given his incredibly extraordinary position in India, politically, I mean, I thought he's the most dominant figure, certainly since Indira Gandhi, and perhaps further back to Nehru. So given his extraordinary position, what happens will depend on him and what he wants. And I suppose one would have to say, I've been having debates with good Indian friends recently about his government, and it's very interesting how widely they differ. I would say at the moment that the jury is out on whether he can lead the Indian economy successfully, and there are some real concerns outside about some of what has happened. But there are also clearly some things he's done which are very admirable.
So I know our time is up, but before I let you go, tell us about your new book. That's your parting shot.
So my parting shot, it's called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And it's essentially how we combine a competitive global market economy with democracy, which has to bring in and gain the support of the mass of the people. and I've arguing that I think this is true in India too, that this hasn't worked well. And for that reason, democracies are generating populist and autocratic figures. And this has happened all over the world. On the whole, there are exceptions. They have not governed well, but they do express the rage and anger of a very large part of the population that feels it's been disrespected and not looked after. And the crisis is very deep. And I think capitalism will survive in some form, but I'm not sure about democracy.
But that sounds very, very, very interesting. So we look forward to it. Martin, thank you very much. Every session with you is a tutorial. That's why the best thing you can do is listen. So thank you very much, and thanks for your patience.
I'll request Medha to really sum up. Thank you, Shekhar. Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, what a fantastic conversation between two remarkable journalists. Thanks so much, Martin, for your very honest and detailed prescription for India. And thanks, Shekhar, for moderating this discussion. It's just fantastic how in a short span of 60 minutes, you all managed to cover such a wide range of subjects. And like Shekhar said, provide us a live tutorial for the rebound and revival of the economy. In summary, if I can just say that, COVID has been a black swan type event. The economic disruption that it has caused will have a lingering impact in India's case, especially on communities like small businesses, merchants, the informal sector, people engaged in agriculture, people engaged in construction, the migrant workers, and we've already seen the beginning of that, and there is impact 2.0 which is yet to come. And if I can also add that the next normal will see more connectivity, more collaboration, and more openness between economies, within countries. And it's a precautionist view which we need to have to really build India into self-reliant and Atmanirbhar, as we now call it. Thanks once again, Martin and Shekhar, and thank you, PAFI, for organizing this remarkable discussion. And for the audience, thank you for tuning in. Please stay logged in as we will be getting into the next session immediately after. Thank you.